Subscribe to Keep It Terrifying for creepy tales, horror, and nightmares you won't forget. Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button and keep it terrifying. Part 1, The Unveiling. Bert had always been an artist, though not a renowned one. His works had never graced the walls of galleries or the pages of magazines. He was the type of artist who preferred solitude over acclaim, sketching in the dim light of his apartment with only the sound of his breath and the occasional drip of rain against the window to keep him company. But there was one painting, one piece of work that was different, something that haunted him, something that felt alive in ways he couldn't fully understand. It was an oil painting, the subject a woman in a dark room, with just the faintest trace of moonlight illuminating her face. Her eyes were hauntingly vacant, as if staring into the abyss of a place Bert himself had never been. He had painted her 3 years ago, and ever since, it had stayed in his studio, tucked away behind a curtain. Bert had kept it hidden from the world. No one had seen it, not even his closest friends. It wasn't that he thought it was bad. In fact, it was one of his finest works. But there was something about the way the woman in the painting looked at him, something unsettling. Every time he caught sight of it, a sense of unease would creep over him, like a cold whisper at the back of his mind. The way her eyes followed him, even when he moved around the room, made him feel as though she was alive. And though he tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination, the sensation never fully went away. One evening, as the rain tapped gently against his window, Bert sat down with a glass of wine. He had been struggling with a creative block for weeks, unable to summon the inspiration to start a new piece. His studio felt stifling, the walls closing in on him. His eyes wandered to the painting, hidden behind the curtain. Maybe it was time to face it, he thought. He pulled the curtain aside and revealed the piece. The moment his eyes met hers, a chill ran down his spine. She was still there, watching him, her gaze as vacant and piercing as it had always been. He took a step forward, almost compelled by some unseen force. The air around him seemed heavier, the room growing colder, though the radiator hummed quietly in the corner. Bert leaned closer, studying the details of the woman's face. Her skin was pale, almost sickly, and her lips were barely a whisper of color. There was an eerie stillness to her, as though she was trapped in a moment of time, forever frozen in the space between life and death. But it wasn't just the painting itself that disturbed him, it was the feeling that something wasn't right. Something was off, something he couldn't quite place. He reached out a hand, his fingers brushing the surface of the canvas. The texture of the oil paint was smooth, cold to the touch. And yet, there was a subtle pulse beneath his fingers, a vibration he couldn't explain. His heart skipped a beat, his mind racing. Was it possible that this painting had some kind of life to it? He quickly pulled his hand back, suddenly aware of how his breathing had quickened. A cold sweat formed on his forehead. It was just a painting, Bert, he thought. Just a painting. But as he turned away to put the curtain back, he felt it again, the sensation of being watched. The woman's eyes burned into his back, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting for something. Her gaze felt almost expectant. He pulled the curtain closed and backed away from the easel, his heart pounding in his chest. That night, as he tried to fall asleep, he couldn't stop thinking about her, the woman in the painting. He tossed and turned, but sleep wouldn't come. The thought of her eyes, locked in that eternal stare, consumed him. And in the darkness of his room, he couldn't help but wonder, what was she waiting for? Part 2, The Whispering Canvas. Bert couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It clung to him throughout the day, seeping into every corner of his mind. The hours at the studio seemed to stretch on endlessly as he worked, yet his thoughts would always return to the painting in the corner. He'd tell himself to ignore it, that it was nothing more than a figment of his overactive imagination, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. The more he thought about it, the more the unease gnawed at him, until it became a constant hum in the back of his mind. The sensation of her eyes following him never left. It didn't matter where he stood in the room, whether he was working on a sketch or even cleaning up brushes, he could always feel her gaze, as though the woman in the painting was somehow aware of him. A shiver ran down his spine every time he caught sight of it. The air in his studio felt heavier, thick with something he couldn't define. That evening, Bert sat in front of the painting again. He had told himself he wouldn't let it control him, but something was pulling him back. There was a strange compulsion, an irresistible urge to study the woman's face once more. He pulled aside the curtain, revealing her haunting stare. The woman's lips, once faint, now seemed to curl into a subtle, unsettling smile, something he could have sworn wasn't there before. His breath hitched. Bert leaned in closer, his face inches from the canvas. There was something different, something almost alive about it. Her eyes, those pale, unblinking eyes, seemed to shimmer, as though they were no longer painted but something more organic. For a brief moment, he thought he saw them twitch, a faint flicker of movement. He recoiled, his heartbeat quickening. No, it was just his imagination, he told himself. But deep down, that creeping doubt returned. Could it be possible? Could the painting somehow be alive? As he pulled away, he noticed something else, an odd, faint noise. It was almost imperceptible, a soft, raspy sound. At first, he thought it was just the creak of the old house settling, but then he heard it again. A whisper. Quiet, almost like a breath, carried through the air from the painting itself. The sound was so faint it could have been a trick of the wind, or was it? He strained his ears, his body tense. His eyes darted around the room, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, this time louder, as though the woman in the painting was speaking directly to him. "Help me." The words were faint, but unmistakable. Bert's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat. His mind raced. He stumbled backward, his pulse pounding in his ears. This was insane. He had to be dreaming, or maybe the wine from earlier had affected him more than he realized. But he couldn't ignore it. The whisper had been so real, so visceral. He felt a chill wash over him, cold enough to freeze the blood in his veins. The woman's expression seemed to shift, becoming more desperate, her lips parting slightly as if trying to form words. Bert's hands shook, his mind grappling with what he was seeing. He quickly grabbed the curtain and threw it over the painting, closing it off from view. He stood there in the center of the room, panting, his mind in turmoil. What was happening? What was this thing? A painting couldn't speak. It couldn't, no, it wasn't possible. He rushed to the door and stepped outside, needing air. The streets outside were eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that made everything feel hollow. The late autumn wind bit at his skin, but it did little to calm the storm raging in his mind. Bert ran a hand through his disheveled hair, trying to think. He had to get away from the studio, clear his mind. But the whispers followed him, haunting the edges of his thoughts. "Help me." The voice repeated in his head, echoing through the corridors of his consciousness like a broken record. He shook his head, trying to force the thought away. The night stretched on, and sleep, when it finally came, was no relief. It was fragmented and restless, plagued by nightmares that felt too real. He dreamt of the woman from the painting, but in his dreams, she was not confined to the canvas. She was standing beside him, her hollow eyes staring into his soul. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her face was twisted in a way that made his stomach churn. Bert awoke in a cold sweat, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. The room felt suffocating. His eyes flickered toward the corner where the painting sat, the curtain drawn over it as if to shield him from whatever horrors lay within. But even with the fabric obscuring it, he could feel the presence of the woman, lurking just behind the veil, waiting. His mind was unraveling. He couldn't keep living like this. Part 3, The Descent. The following days dragged by in a haze for Bert. His life had become a blur of unease, the creeping dread of the painting hanging over him like a dark cloud. He could no longer escape it. It wasn't just the whispering or the strange flickers of movement he had imagined in the canvas, it was something deeper. Something darker. He couldn't paint anymore. His brushes lay still on the table, untouched, gathering dust. Each time he sat down to work, his eyes would wander to the corner of the room, and the pull of the painted woman's gaze would be enough to paralyze him. He had tried to cover it with a cloth, to hide it away from sight, but it didn't matter. The painting still called to him, louder than ever, each passing hour. One night, when the house was thick with silence, Bert found himself walking toward the studio once again. He told himself it was foreclosure. He had to face this. He had to confront whatever was happening. He could no longer hide from it, no matter how terrifying it was. He had always been in control of his work, of his mind, before. This painting, this damnable painting, was slowly chipping away at that control, and he couldn't let it win. The studio door creaked open, and the musty scent of oil paint and dust flooded his senses. The room was cold, despite the heat still running through the house. He flicked on the light, and his eyes were drawn immediately to the corner. There it was, the painting. Covered by the cloth, but somehow, Bert could still feel it, almost as if it were radiating a low, humming energy. His pulse quickened. The voice. The whispers. They were growing stronger. "Help me." Bert's breath hitched. The sound came from behind the cloth, louder this time, clearer. Not just a whisper, but a full, throaty plea, a sound that seemed to reverberate in the air like it was coming from within the very walls of the room. He stood frozen for a long moment, his body trembling. The rational part of him screamed to leave, to run far, far away from the studio and never come back. But the rest of him, the part that couldn't ignore it, the part that was terrified of what would happen if he didn't, moved closer. His hand shook as he reached for the cloth. He pulled it away slowly, afraid of what he would see. And when the cloth dropped to the floor, his breath caught in his throat. The woman in the painting was different. Her lips were no longer a faint trace of color, they were now vivid, a deep shade of red. The expression on her face had twisted from that empty vacancy to something more desperate. Her eyes, those hollow, endless eyes, seemed to bulge from the canvas, staring at him with such intensity that it felt as though they were piercing through his soul. Bert stumbled backward, his hand pressed against his mouth, trying to stifle the gasp that threatened to escape. His legs felt weak, his head spinning. It was happening again, the sense of being consumed by her gaze. It was all-encompassing, suffocating. "Please." The whisper came again, louder this time, a tortured sound that scraped at his very mind. "Help me. Before it's too late." Bert's vision blurred, and he swore he could see the faintest hint of movement in the woman's figure. Her hands, he could see them now, seemed to twitch. His throat tightened. He had to leave. He had to get out of here. But then something else happened. Something that sent an icy chill down his spine. The canvas began to warp, its edges rippling as though it were alive, the paint flowing and shifting in unnatural ways. The face of the woman stretched, her features distorting into grotesque shapes as she reached out, her fingers scraping at the edges of the frame. Bert couldn't breathe. His feet were glued to the floor, his body paralyzed in fear. Her mouth twisted into a grin that looked far too wide, as if it shouldn't belong on her face at all. She opened her mouth, but this time, it wasn't a whisper that came out. It was a shriek, a sound so high-pitched and unnatural that Bert's ears began to ring. "You can't escape me," the voice now said, its tone darker, deeper, more insistent. "I will have you. I will never leave." Bert staggered backward, gasping for air. He couldn't take it anymore. This thing, this painting, was not just a piece of art. It was something else. Something dark, ancient, and beyond his understanding. And it wanted him. The room spun around him, the walls closing in, the air thick with an oppressive force. It felt like the very room was alive, as if it had become a living entity itself, a prison that was tightening its grip around him. He turned and ran, no, fled. His heart raced as his footsteps echoed in the narrow hallways of the house. He crashed through the front door and into the night air, gasping, trying to breathe, trying to clear the overwhelming fog in his mind. He didn't stop running. He didn't know where he was going, just that he had to get as far away as possible from the studio. As far away from the woman in the painting. But no matter how far he ran, he could still hear her voice, still feel her presence haunting the edges of his thoughts. The wind howled around him, the darkness of the night pressing in on him from all sides. And as he stumbled down the empty street, one thought consumed him above all else: it's too late. There's no escaping her now. Part 4. The mark. Bert's feet pounded against the cold pavement as he stumbled through the night. His mind was a jumbled mess of panic, his thoughts racing in every direction. The woman in the painting, the voice, the shriek, the way she moved, it was all too much. His chest was tight, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he ran, though he had no clear destination in mind. He needed to escape. That's all he could think. He needed to be far, far away from the studio, from that house. The painting had crossed some line, some boundary between reality and something darker. And now, he was its prisoner. But the further he ran, the more he felt the weight of it pressing down on him. Her voice was still there, barely audible, but persistent, whispering in the back of his mind. "You can't escape me." It was like a mantra, repeating over and over, winding around his thoughts, suffocating him. By the time he reached the edge of the city, Bert's legs were aching, his body drenched in sweat despite the chill in the air. His feet felt like lead, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't let himself stop. The darkness of the night seemed to stretch endlessly before him, but even with the vast open space ahead, he felt as though the walls of his mind were closing in. He stopped at the corner of an abandoned street, leaning against a lamppost to catch his breath. His vision blurred, and he closed his eyes, trying to steady himself. The street was quiet, almost too quiet. The city was far behind him now, and yet, it felt like there was no escape. The air around him seemed heavy, as though something unseen was watching. The sensation that he wasn't alone began to creep up his spine. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling. His palms slick with sweat, his fingers numb. As he stared at them, he noticed something strange. A dark, reddish mark, almost like a bruise, was slowly forming on his wrist. At first, he thought it was nothing, a trick of the light, or maybe an injury from when he had knocked into the corner of the studio in his frantic escape. But as he rubbed it, the mark didn't fade. In fact, it deepened. The mark wasn't just a bruise, it was a symbol. Intricate, twisted lines that looked as though they had been burned into his skin. A dark, spiraling pattern that made his stomach churn just to look at it. His heart skipped a beat as he traced the lines with his fingers. It was unnatural. The pattern wasn't just some random injury. It looked deliberate, like something carved with intention. He gasped, suddenly realizing the terrifying truth. The mark was familiar. It was the same symbol that had been etched into the frame of the painting. Bert's pulse thundered in his ears. His mind swirled with confusion, fear, and a growing sense of dread. This couldn't be happening. There was no way. His hands shook as he tried to wipe the mark off, but it remained stubbornly etched into his skin, the lines growing darker with each passing second. The whispers, once faint and distant, now grew louder, more insistent. "You're mine now, Bert." The voice wasn't just in his head. It was all around him, in the very air, in the very fabric of reality itself. "You have been marked." Bert's breath caught in his throat. His hands clenched into fists, but the pain of the mark only deepened, like it was inside him. It burned. His eyes darted around the street, searching for any sign of life, anything that could help him understand what was happening, but the street was still, empty. There was no one to call, no one to help. He had to get rid of the mark. He had to find a way to stop it before it consumed him, before the painting did. His feet moved on their own, driven by desperation. He had no clear destination, no plan, only the overwhelming urge to find answers. His mind raced with theories. Maybe it was a curse. Maybe the painting had some power that was transferring to him. It felt like something ancient, something that predated time itself. As he stumbled down the alley, he found himself at a crossroads, an abandoned part of town he didn't recognize. The streetlights flickered above him, casting long, eerie shadows. A sudden cold wind swept through the alley, making him shiver. Then, through the haze of his panic, Bert noticed something strange. At the end of the alley was a door. It was old, weathered, but it wasn't just any door, it was exactly like the one from his studio, the one that had been hidden behind the curtain. The one he'd seen every day but had never dared to open. The door was real. Bert's stomach twisted. He couldn't breathe as his feet carried him toward it, his mind screaming at him to stop, to turn around, but his body wouldn't listen. He reached for the handle, and as his fingers brushed against it, the door swung open without a sound. The air beyond was thick with darkness. The smell of oil paint and dust hit him immediately, familiar, but somehow wrong. The door led into the studio. Into his studio. His heart pounded in his chest. How was this possible? He had just left the city. He had just been running. How had he ended up here? The whispers flooded his mind again, louder than ever, growing into a maddening chorus. You can't escape. Bert stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. He spun around, but there was no way out. He was back in the room with the painting, the one that had tormented him for days. The walls seemed to close in on him, the air growing thick with a suffocating pressure. He turned to the easel, the painting still there, waiting. But it wasn't the same as before. The woman's eyes had moved, no longer locked in that haunting stare, but now looking directly at him. Her lips curled into a grin, and her skin, once pale, was now a sickly shade of gray, like something that had been left to rot. And the mark on Bert's wrist, it burned hotter now. The pattern was no longer just on his skin. It had spread, creeping up his arm, winding around his body like a creeping vine. He tried to claw at it, but it was like the mark had become part of him. It felt like his skin was being seared, like he was becoming the painting. The woman's voice echoed in his mind. You will never leave me. You will be mine, forever. Bert screamed, his voice swallowed by the darkness. Part 5, The Binding. Bert's pulse hammered in his ears as the air around him grew thick with the oppressive weight of something ancient, something that had no place in this world. His vision blurred as the pain in his arm spread, the mark crawling under his skin like a living thing, burning hotter with each passing second. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe, only feel the cold, relentless pressure. The woman in the painting, the thing in the painting, smiled wider now, her mouth stretching unnaturally, her teeth glinting in the dim light. The grin was grotesque, like something ripped from the darkest corners of his nightmares. Her eyes, once vacant, now glowed with an unnatural intensity. They burned into him, pulling him closer, pulling him in. You're mine now, Bert, her voice echoed around him, both inside his head and reverberating in the very room. It was deep, rich with malice, but there was something else buried beneath it, something desperate. You can never leave me. Bert's legs buckled, and he collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The mark on his wrist was spreading, tendrils of dark, crimson energy spiraling up his arm and across his chest, as though it was merging with his very soul. He clawed at it, but the more he tried to tear it off, the deeper it burrowed into his flesh. His breaths came in ragged gasps. The room was closing in on him, the edges of reality itself warping like liquid. The painting. No, the thing in the painting, was reaching out for him now. He could see it move, her fingers stretching, impossibly long, reaching past the confines of the canvas. She was pulling him in, he could feel the pressure of her presence, as though the very walls of the room were bending to her will, drawing him toward the easel like a moth to a flame. Bert's eyes darted around in a panic, desperate for any escape. There was no door. No window. Just him and the painting, and the suffocating feeling that this was the end. But as his gaze flickered to the canvas, he noticed something. The woman's smile had shifted. It was no longer a grin of malice. Now, there was something else behind it, a deep, soul-crushing sadness. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. The painting wasn't just a trap, it was alive, but not in the way he had thought. She wasn't trying to consume him out of malice alone. She was suffering. There was a depth of pain in her eyes that Bert had failed to see before. A loneliness that was as dark and cold as the void itself. Help me, Bert, her voice came again, but this time it was softer, pleading, desperate. Please. Help me. Bert's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the weight of her gaze now more than ever, but it was different. It wasn't just an external force pulling at him, it was something inside of him. A flicker of understanding, of sympathy. But how could he help her? She was a painting. A painting. She had no body, No soul, no way to experience the world in the way he did. And yet, she was speaking to him. She was begging him. And somehow, Bert felt that if he didn't help her, the consequences would be worse than what he had already endured. A sudden, overwhelming compulsion took hold of him. He had to look closer. He had to understand. He pushed himself to his feet, his body shaking from the pain of the mark. His legs wobbled, barely able to support him as he crawled toward the easel. He leaned in, his face inches from the canvas, his mind buzzing with questions. The woman's face, her eyes, held him captive. There was something in them, something familiar. Her mouth barely moved, but the words came, clear as day. You have to finish what was started. Bert's heart stopped. The words felt like a punch to his gut. What did that mean? What had been started? He staggered backward, trying to make sense of it, but the room swayed around him. The mark on his wrist was nearly burning through his skin, and he could feel it, the pull of the painting, the dark force that wrapped itself around him. He was losing control. He could feel it slipping through his fingers. His gaze fell to the floor, and that's when he saw it, the old, crumpled sketchbook he had long forgotten. It had been tossed aside in a corner of the room, discarded like an old relic. His hand reached out instinctively, as if something beyond him was guiding it. He pulled the book from the pile of dust and opened it to the first page. And there it was. A sketch of the very same woman from the painting. She was there, captured in charcoal, her face drawn with tender strokes, her eyes filled with the same vacant emptiness he had seen in the artwork. The drawing was old, one of his first pieces, but what struck him the most was the page directly opposite it. Another drawing. This one was different. It wasn't the woman anymore. Instead, it was a figure, a tall, shadowy silhouette, looming over her. And at the bottom of the page, in his own handwriting, were the words, "She is waiting for me." Bert froze, the blood draining from his face. The sketch was his. He had drawn it years ago, long before he painted the woman. And yet, he had no memory of doing so. No memory of drawing the shadow that loomed over her. And the words, "She is waiting for me," sounded so familiar, so real. It was like a memory trying to break free from the recesses of his mind. The room was spinning. The mark on his arm pulsed, sending waves of agony through his body. He couldn't focus. His mind was a whirlwind of questions. What did this mean? How was he connected to the painting? What had he done? "You have to finish what was started," the woman's voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. Her eyes were pleading with him. "Please. You are the one who can release me. You must finish it. The painting. It is a trap. For both of us." Her words cut through the storm in his mind. Trap. Finish it. Bert stumbled back, his eyes wide with horror. Was she asking him to paint again? To somehow undo the curse he had unknowingly started? The very thought of returning to that easel, of bringing her to life again, made his stomach churn. But the mark burned. It burned like fire. And in the depths of his mind, he heard something darker, something more sinister, a voice that whispered, low and cruel, "If you don't, you'll never leave. You'll never be free." Bert's eyes locked on the painting again. The woman's gaze was unwavering. And now, in the pit of his stomach, he understood. She wasn't just waiting for him to finish. She was waiting for him to release her, before it was too late for both of them. Part 6, The Choice. Bert's mind spun with the weight of the woman's words, the pull of the painting growing stronger by the second. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to leave, to escape this nightmare. But the mark on his skin, no, the thing inside him, was demanding something else. It was a force far greater than his willpower. It was a compulsion, a burning need to understand, to finish what he had started. He glanced at the sketchbook again, the memory of the words he had written, "She is waiting for me," ringing in his mind like a bell tolling. There was something about it, something he didn't yet understand. He had drawn her, years ago, without even knowing who she was. But now, he was certain. He had known her all along. She had been waiting for him, not just on the canvas, but in the very fabric of his reality. The room around him seemed to distort further, warping like a liquid mirror. Shadows twisted and stretched unnaturally. The floor felt unstable, as though the very foundation was giving way beneath him. He could hear her voice again, clearer than ever. "You have to finish it, Bert." Her tone was no longer pleading. It was authoritative, as if she were commanding him. As if she had the power to make him obey. The cold, unbearable pressure of her gaze felt like a vice on his chest. "Finish what?" Bert whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and desperation. "What do you want from me?" The painting flickered, and he swore he saw the faintest movement in the woman's eyes. Her lips parted, but instead of words, a soundless scream poured from her mouth, as if she were trapped in a prison he could not see. Her form began to distort again, her fingers stretching out toward him, as if reaching beyond the canvas itself. "You are the one who can free me." The words sent a shiver down his spine, but now he understood. She wasn't just waiting for him to finish painting. She was trapped within the painting, bound by it. And now, she was trying to use him, his soul, to escape. Bert's legs shook beneath him as he stood there, frozen by the realization. He felt the mark on his wrist flare again, as though it were alive. It wasn't just on his skin. It was something deeper. It was him. The painting was no longer just a creation, it was part of him, part of his very essence. He could feel it now, like a tether, a connection that had always been there, even before he picked up the brush. The woman's face blurred and twisted, the lines of her features becoming more grotesque by the second. She was becoming something else. Something darker. "You have to finish it, Bert," her voice thundered in his mind, shaking the very walls of the room. "You have to complete me. Or we both die." He staggered backward, his heart pounding in his chest. "How?" he gasped. "How can I finish it? What do you want from me?" The woman's eyes bore into him, glowing with an intensity that felt like fire. For a moment, her face softened, and Bert saw something behind the madness, something vulnerable, something human. "I was once a living woman," she whispered, her voice softer now. "I was trapped here. Long before you painted me." Her eyes filled with sorrow. "The painting is a prison, Bert. And you're the key." Bert's mind reeled. He had always thought the painting was just his creation, his work of art. But now, the truth felt more horrifying than anything he could have imagined. The woman hadn't just been trapped in the canvas. She had been here before, in his life, in his world, and somehow, he had unknowingly set her free when he picked up the brush. "I never meant to," his voice faltered, barely able to speak the words. "It doesn't matter anymore," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You have already chosen. You can't escape what you've started." Her eyes darkened again, and the pressure in the room intensified, like a storm about to break. "Either you finish what you began and release me, or we both suffer forever." Bert's mind raced. Finish it. He didn't know what that meant. What was the painting? What was it supposed to become? He glanced at the easel. The brush was still there, waiting. The canvas was unfinished. His eyes flicked to the page of the sketchbook. The shadow that loomed behind the woman. The figure that had been there all along, just beyond the edge of the drawing. The shadow. His hand trembled as he reached for the sketchbook again, flipping through the pages, searching for the next clue. And there it was, an image, hidden beneath layers of sketches and half-formed ideas. A figure, barely recognizable. It was him. The realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. The shadow in the sketchbook wasn't just any figure. It was his reflection. The unfinished image was of him, standing in the same posture as the woman in the painting, arms outstretched, trapped, pulling her in. He felt his stomach twist as the pieces fell into place. The painting wasn't just a trap for her, it was a trap for both of them. The act of painting her had bound them both. And now, he had to finish it. But to finish it, he had to become part of the painting. He had to merge with her. "Finish it, Bert," the woman repeated, her voice a whisper now, soft and fragile. "Please. Before it's too late." The walls around him seemed to close in, the air thick with despair. The mark burned. His entire body screamed for release, but there was no escape. And then, in that moment of unbearable pressure, The woman's voice changed again, her tone darkening with an unmistakable venom. "If you refuse." Her words echoed in the room, sending a chill down Bert's spine. "I will drag you into this canvas. You will become mine forever, a part of the painting. You will never leave. Not in this life. Not in the next." Bert's breath caught in his throat. The thought of being trapped forever, bound to the painting, was worse than death. Worse than the madness that threatened to consume him. But there was still a choice. A choice he had to make. With trembling hands, Bert reached for the brush. His heart pounded as he dipped it into the paint, his fingers moving on their own, instinctively pulling him toward the canvas. The brush hovered in front of him, its bristles quivering in his grip. The woman's eyes locked with his, pleading, desperate. Would he finish it? Would he surrender, completing the painting and releasing her, or would he refuse, condemning himself to an eternity within the canvas? Part 7, The Final Stroke. The brush hovered in the air, trembling in Bert's hand like a lifeline, pulling him toward an unknown future. His mind was a blur of fear, confusion, and something else, something darker. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, the intense pull of the painting, the mark on his wrist still burning, pulsing as if it had become one with him. The woman's eyes, full of desperate pleading, bored into him. He could see the anguish there now, the torment that went beyond her imprisonment. It wasn't just a matter of freedom. No, there was something deeper, more personal about her torment. She was suffering in a way he couldn't fully understand, but the more he looked at her, the more he realized that he was tied to her suffering in ways he didn't want to admit. Her voice came again, soft and desperate. "Finish it, Bert. Set me free. Please." His heart raced as he stared at the canvas. The painting loomed before him like a portal, the unfinished woman still reaching out, pulling at him, urging him to make the final move. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to step back, to drop the brush, to leave the room. But his hand wouldn't obey. It was as if the brush itself had a mind of its own, as if it were alive, pulling him in. His mind screamed, "No, no, no, I can't." But his body didn't listen. He could feel the compulsion deep in his bones, a primal urge to complete what he had started. The room was closing in on him, the shadows stretching longer, the air thick with the promise of something ancient. Something that had been waiting for this moment, for this final stroke. "Finish it, Bert." The woman's voice was barely a whisper now, but it was filled with an unbearable weight. "We are both trapped. You can't escape me until you do. You can't escape me. Until you free me." The room swayed, a dizzying vertigo crashing over him as his fingers twitched toward the canvas. He was torn. On one hand, he wanted to refuse, to walk away from the nightmare he had created. But on the other, something inside him, something primal, was telling him that if he didn't finish it, he would become just another victim of the painting. Just another soul trapped in its twisted web. Bert's eyes flickered back to the woman. There was something in her eyes now that made his stomach turn, regret. She wasn't just a victim of the painting, of her own curse. No. She was a part of the curse, a keeper of it. A force bound to the very brush he held. But he couldn't leave her like this. He couldn't leave her trapped inside the painting. Not after everything he had learned. And so, with a shaky breath, he dipped the brush into the dark, oily paint. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he touched the brush to the canvas. The sensation was not what he expected. It wasn't just the smooth glide of paint on fabric. No, this was different. The brush seemed to sink into the canvas, as if it were sinking into something else, something much deeper. Like he was not just painting, but merging with the fabric of the painting itself. The moment the bristles touched the surface, the room seemed to bend, the shadows lengthening and stretching, curling in on themselves like tendrils of smoke. Bert's vision blurred as the mark on his wrist burned so hot it felt like fire. His hand moved, almost of its own accord. "The painting is me. And I am the painting." Each stroke of the brush felt like it was pulling him in deeper. The colors swirled before his eyes, blending together, the canvas rippling under his touch. He could feel it now, feel the connection, the ancient bond that tied him to this work of art. He was creating not just a picture, but a fate. His own fate. The woman's face began to change, her features distorting. At first, it was subtle, an arch of her eyebrow, a slight curve of her lips, but as he painted, the changes became more pronounced. The sorrow in her eyes grew into something darker, something demonic. Her mouth opened wider, revealing teeth like jagged stones, and her fingers stretched even further, long and unnaturally thin, wrapping around the edges of the frame like claws. And still, Bert painted. His hand moved mechanically, as though it were not his own. It was like the painting itself was guiding him, telling him where to go next, telling him what to paint. And with each stroke, the woman's form became less human. Her face twisted into a grotesque caricature of beauty, something horrifying and unnatural. The darkness inside her seemed to bleed through the canvas, seeping into the room itself. And then, the final stroke. Bert's hand froze as the brush made contact with the canvas one last time. The moment the bristles touched, the entire room shuddered. The mark on his wrist exploded with pain, like every nerve in his body was being torn apart. He gasped, falling to his knees as the pain intensified, spiraling out of control. His vision went black, and for a moment, he thought he was dying. But then, something changed. The pressure in the room dissipated, the suffocating weight of the painting lifting from his chest. The room felt lighter, airier. The shadows that had once been twisted and deformed seemed to straighten out, as though the entire world was breathing again. The pain in Bert's wrist faded, leaving only a faint scar where the mark had been. He looked down at it, blinking in confusion. He stood, slowly, his mind still reeling. The painting before him had changed. The woman was gone. Or rather, she had transformed. The figure in the canvas was now a dark silhouette, indistinct, yet strangely familiar. It was as if the woman's form had been absorbed into something else, something new. The once detailed, haunting image had been replaced by an empty, almost ethereal shape, as though she had finally broken free of the prison. But Bert realized too late, he had become a part of her. His reflection stared back at him from the painting, his face pale, his eyes wide with horror. He had finished the painting. He had freed her. And in doing so, he had become her. The room around him fell into silence, and Bert felt the cold weight of finality press against his chest. His body seemed to lose its substance, as if he were fading into the very canvas, becoming a figure within the painting. And then, he heard her voice once more. "Thank you, Bert. You've freed us both."